Number 1. The Library of Córdoba. Picture the largest city in Europe in the 10th century. Not Rome, not Paris, not London. It was Córdoba, in southern Spain, the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate of Al-Andalus, a city of perhaps 500,000 people with paved streets, running water, and street lamps at a time when most of Europe lived in mud. And at the heart of this city sat one of the greatest libraries the world had ever assembled. The man who built it was Caliph Al-Hakam II, who ruled from 961 to 976. He was a bibliophile in the truest sense. He sent agents across the Islamic world, to Cairo, to Baghdad, to Damascus, with instructions to buy any book of value, and if it could not be bought, to copy it. The collection that resulted held, by Arabic accounts, around 400,000 volumes. The catalog alone filled 44 registers of 50 pages each. To understand how staggering that was, consider that the largest libraries in Christian Europe at the same moment held a few hundred books. Córdoba had paper mills, which made books cheaper to produce here than anywhere in the West, and the city supported around 70 libraries across Al-Andalus. Among the scribes was a woman named Lubna of Córdoba, a copyist and mathematician who worked in the palace library itself. So, how did this treasure burn? When Al-Hakam died in 976, his son Hisham II was only 10 or 11 years old. Real power slipped into the hands of the chamberlain, a ruthless military commander named Al-Mansur, whom Christians called Al-Manzor. To secure his position, Al-Manzor needed the support of the conservative religious scholars, the fuqaha, who deeply distrusted what they called the ancient sciences. So Al-Manzor made a calculated sacrifice. Around 978 to 980, he ordered the library purged. Books on philosophy, astronomy, logic, and astrology were pulled from the shelves and publicly burned. Works on Islamic law and Quranic study were spared. Only the Greek-derived rational knowledge was fed to the flames, because that was the price of clerical loyalty. The rest of the collection scattered during the Civil War that tore the caliphate apart between 1009 and 1031. Some say the numbers were exaggerated by later writers. Others believe the most dangerous astronomical works were singled out deliberately. Either way, a civilization had burned its own mind to win a political bargain. And that pattern, it turns out, would repeat for the next 1,000 years. Number 2. The Jaffna Library burning. If you think burning libraries belongs to the distant past, the next story should change your mind, because it happened within living memory. In the Tamil majority north of Sri Lanka stood the Jaffna Public Library, opened in 1934, and rehoused in a magnificent white Indo-Saracenic building completed around 1959. By 1981, it held roughly 97,000 books and manuscripts, making it one of the largest libraries in all of Asia. But it was not the number of books that made it priceless. It was what those books were. The shelves held rare Ola manuscripts, texts written on palm leaves, some of them centuries old. It held the only surviving copy of the Yalpana Vaipava Malai, a history of the Jaffna kingdom that existed nowhere else on earth. For the Tamil people, this building was not just a library, it was the physical memory of who they were. Then came the night of May 31st to June 1st, 1981. Against a backdrop of local elections and rising ethnic tension, after 2 policemen had been killed at a political rally days earlier, an organized mob descended on the library. Eyewitnesses reported that the crowd included uniformed police and government-aligned paramilitaries. They doused the building in petrol and set it alight. By morning, nearly the entire collection was ash. Historians now regard this as one of the worst acts of deliberate book destruction, what scholars call biblioclasm, in the entire 20th century. The scholar Rebecca Knuth, in her book Libricide, frames it as state-tolerated cultural destruction, an attempt to erase a people by erasing their records. Sri Lankan government ministers present in Jaffna at the time were implicated by Tamil accounts, though no one was ever prosecuted, and the consequences rippled outward. The burning is widely cited as a catalyzing event that pushed a generation of Tamil youth toward militancy, helping ignite the Sri Lankan Civil War that would rage from 1983 to 2009. The library was eventually rebuilt and fully reopened in 2003, with UNESCO support and book donations arriving from around the world. But for those unique, never-copied manuscripts, the loss was absolute. They cannot be donated back. They are simply gone. And that raises an unsettling question. What kind of ruler burns the memory of his own people on purpose? Number 3. Itzcoatl's burning of the Aztec Codices. The answer to that question takes us across the world and back 5 centuries, to the rise of the Aztec Empire. In the early 15th century, the Mexica people of Tenochtitlan were a rising power. Their 4th ruler, Itzcoatl, whose name means obsidian serpent, reigned from around 1427 to 1440. He came to power as the Mexica threw off the domination of the Tepanec city of Azcapotzalco and formed the famous Triple Alliance around 1428. At his side stood his chief advisor, Tlacaelel, a political genius who held the office of Chihuahuatl and who is remembered as the true architect of Aztec imperial ideology. And it was under their direction that something extraordinary happened. According to the Florentine Codex, compiled decades later by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún from Aztec informants, the Mexica leadership ordered the burning of their own ancient painted books. The reason was chillingly deliberate. The old codices, painted on bark paper and deerskin in pictographic glyphs, recorded a history the new rulers did not like, a history of humble, unremarkable origins. Sahagún's informants explained that the common people did not need to see these old stories. So the books were burned, and in their place a new history was written. This new version elevated the Mexica patron god Huitzilopochtli and recast the Aztecs as a chosen people, destined by the gods to rule. This is one of the rare documented cases in human history of a civilization deliberately destroying its own archive, not to defeat an enemy, but to control its own population. And the rewrite had teeth. The new official history helped justify the Aztec practice of large-scale human sacrifice as a cosmic necessity, a duty to feed the sun and keep the universe from ending. Because of this act, very few genuine pre-conquest Central Mexican codices survive today. Most of what we call Aztec codices were actually produced after the Spanish conquest. Scholars like Miguel León Portilla have pored over Book 10 of the Florentine Codex, trying to reconstruct what was lost. Some historians caution that our main source is itself a colonial friar's compilation, and the scale may be uncertain, but the core lesson stands. Centuries before the word existed, the Aztecs understood that whoever controls the record controls the future. And yet, as deliberate as that burning was, it pales beside a library so enormous that legend says it took months to burn. Number 4. Nalanda Mahavihara. In the green plains of what is now Bihar, in eastern India, stood an institution that has a strong claim to being the world's first true university. Nalanda Mahavihara was founded in the 5th century under the Gupta Emperor Kumaragupta I, who ruled from about 415 to 455. At its height, Nalanda was breathtaking in scale. It housed as many as 10,000 students and somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 teachers, all living and studying together on a single campus. The curriculum was vast, spanning Buddhist philosophy, logic, grammar, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. Students came from across the known world, from China, Korea, Tibet, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. At the center of it all stood the library, a complex so revered it had its own name, Dharmaganja, the Treasury of Truth. It was said to consist of 3 multi-story buildings, called Ratnasagara, Ratnadadi, and Ratnaranjaka. The greatest of them, Ratnadadi, reportedly rose 9 stories into the sky and held the most sacred texts, including the Prajnaparamita Sutras. We know about Nalanda in vivid detail because of the Chinese pilgrim monk Xuanzang, who studied there in the 7th century and wrote down everything he saw. Another pilgrim, Yijing, did the same. Then, in 1193, it ended. The Turkic military commander Bakhtiar Khalji, leading Ghurid forces in the conquest of the Gangetic Plains, fell upon the region. The Persian chronicle Tabakat-i-Nasiri, written around 1260 by Minhaji Siraj, records the destruction of a great Buddhist center, which tradition identifies with Nalanda. And here's the detail that has echoed through the centuries. The library was said to be so vast, holding so many hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, that when it was set ablaze, the fires burned for months. This was a devastating blow to the survival of Buddhism in India itself. Modern excavations, begun by the Archaeological Survey of India in 1915, have uncovered ruins covering some 23 hectares, with monasteries, temples, classrooms, and dormitory cells. In 2016, Nalanda was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Some manuscripts did survive, carried away by fleeing monks to Tibet and Nepal, where they shaped Tibetan Buddhism for centuries. Historians debate the details. The dramatic image of months-long flames comes partly from the later Tibetan writer Taranatha. Some argue internal decline also played a role, but the destruction was real, and it pointed toward a darker possibility. What happens when an entire writing system is reduced to almost nothing? Number 5. The Maya Codices at Maní. On a single afternoon in the summer of 1562, a Spanish friar erased most of a written civilization. The Maya of Mesoamerica had developed the most sophisticated writing system in the entire pre-Columbian Americas, a complex script of logosyllabic glyphs capable of recording anything spoken. They wrote in folding books called Codices, made of fig bark paper coated with fine lime plaster and painted with hieroglyphs and illustrations. These books contained astronomy, ritual, history, and prophecy, the accumulated knowledge of centuries. The friar was Diego de Landa, a Franciscan who had arrived in the Yucatan in 1549. In July of 1562, in the town of Maní, Landa discovered that Maya, who had supposedly converted to Christianity, were still practicing their traditional religion in hidden caves. Enraged, he held an auto da fe, a public act of faith and punishment. He ordered the burning of Maya religious images, and, by his own account, at least 27 codices. He wrote his own confession of the act, describing how the books contained what he called superstition and lies of the devil, and how the Maya, watching their literature burn, felt a degree of affliction that astonished even him. The torture of Maya individuals to extract confessions of idolatry accompanied the flames. The result of that afternoon is one of the most staggering numbers in the history of human knowledge. Of all the thousands of Maya books that once existed, only 4 are known to survive today. 4. They are named for the cities that now hold them: the Dresden, the Madrid, the Paris, and the Grolier, or Maya Codex. The Dresden Codex alone contains astronomical tables so accurate they correctly predict the cycles of the planet Venus and the timing of eclipses. There is a bitter irony here. After Landa was recalled to Spain in 1563 to answer for his harshness, he wrote a book of his own, the Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, in which he recorded a partial alphabet of Maya glyphs. For centuries, that alphabet was misunderstood. Then, in the 1950s, the Soviet linguist Yuri Konorozov used Landa's flawed notes as the key to finally cracking the phonetic basis of Maya writing. The man who burned the library also, by accident, preserved the key to reading it. Some still believe lost codices survive, hidden in caves, waiting. But the loss remains almost total, and it raises a strange image of a book not just burned, but put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to die. Number 6. The burning of the Talmud in Paris. That image is not a metaphor. In 13th century France, a library really was put on trial. The Talmud is the central text of rabbinic Judaism, a vast and intricate compilation of law and commentary, the Babylonian version of which was largely complete by the 6th century. In medieval Europe, every copy was handwritten, making each volume extraordinarily expensive and the product of countless hours of labor. The trouble began in 1239, when a Jewish convert to Christianity named Nicholas Donin brought 35 formal charges against the Talmud to Pope Gregory IX. Donin, who had been excommunicated from his own community before converting, used his insider knowledge to allege that the Talmud contained blasphemies against Jesus and that it had wrongly replaced the Hebrew Bible as the authority for Jews. The Pope ordered the confiscation of Jewish books across Christendom, but only one monarch fully complied, King Louis IX of France, the king later canonized as Saint Louis. In June of 1240, the French royal court hosted what became known as the Disputation of Paris, a formal debate that was really a trial. 4 rabbis, led by the courageous Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, were forced to defend the Talmud before a Christian tribunal that included Queen Blanche of Castile. The outcome was effectively decided in advance. The book was convicted of blasphemy, and so, in 1242, the sentence was carried out. An estimated 24 cartloads of manuscripts, perhaps 12,000 hand-copied volumes of the Talmud and related works, were hauled to the Place de Grève in the center of Paris and burned in a single enormous fire. The loss was catastrophic, because each of those volumes represented years of a scribe's life. The tragedy was so profound that Rabbi Meir of Rothenburg composed an elegy, Sha'ali Serufa Ba'esh, asking the Torah scroll consumed by fire about its fate. That lament is still recited today on Tisha B'Av, the Jewish day of mourning. The Paris burning was not the end. It set a precedent for further burnings of the Talmud across Europe for centuries, including a major one in Italy in 1553. It marked a historic shift in Christian policy, from grudging toleration toward the active suppression of Jewish texts. The historian Robert Chazan has shown how this single event reshaped Jewish life in medieval Europe. A book had been tried, judged, and executed, but the most shocking betrayal may be when Christians turned their fire on the greatest Christian library of all. Number 7. The Imperial Library of Constantinople. For nearly 1,000 years, the city of Constantinople was the guardian of Western civilization's memory. Its imperial library was established in the 4th century, traditionally credited to the Emperor Constantius II, who reigned from 337 to 361. Around 357, the scholar Themistius organized a team of skilled calligraphers with a vital mission: to copy the crumbling works of ancient Greece from fragile papyrus onto durable parchment before they were lost forever. Because of this work, the writings of Homer, of the great tragedians, of Plato and Aristotle, survived the collapse of the Western Roman world. While much of Western Europe forgot how to read Greek, Constantinople preserved it. The libraries of the city, imperial, patriarchal, and monastic, together formed the single greatest concentration of books in the Christian world. The collection had survived fires before, including a terrible blaze in 473 that reportedly consumed 120,000 volumes. But the deepest wound was self-inflicted by Christendom itself. In 1204, the soldiers of the Fourth Crusade, who had set out to fight in the Holy Land, were instead diverted to Constantinople. With the backing of the Venetians under their aged and ambitious doge, Enrico Dandolo, the Crusaders besieged and stormed the greatest Christian city on earth. For 3 days they looted it. Bronze statues were melted down for coin. Priceless manuscripts were burned, scattered, or stolen. The Byzantine historian Nikitas Choniates witnessed the destruction firsthand and recorded the horror of fellow Christians desecrating the city. The sack of 1204 permanently broke the Byzantine Empire. It never fully recovered, and the wound it suffered set the empire on the long road to its final fall to the Ottomans in 1453. We know that entire works of literature vanished in this period, plays by Sophocles and Euripides that we can name only because other surviving texts mention them. Some manuscripts were carried westward to Italy, where centuries later they would help spark the Renaissance recovery of classical learning. The historian Stephen Runciman called the Fourth Crusade's sack one of the greatest crimes against civilization in history, and it deepened the bitter schism between the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic churches, a rupture that has never fully healed. The Crusaders destroyed a library of pagan and sacred knowledge in the name of faith, but they were not the first to burn a temple full of books because of the gods it served. Number 8. The Serapeum of Alexandria. Long before the Crusaders, in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, there stood a temple so magnificent that ancient writers ranked it among the wonders of the world. It was the Serapeum, dedicated to the syncretic Greco-Egyptian god Serapis, built by the Ptolemies in the 3rd century before the Common Era. It rose on a hill in the Rakotis district, a complex of columns and halls, and it housed something precious, a daughter library of the famous Great Library of Alexandria, said to hold tens of thousands of scrolls, with one figure of 42,800 sometimes cited. By the late 4th century of the Common Era, Alexandria had become a violent flashpoint, a city where pagans, Christians, and Jews clashed in the streets. In 391, the Emperor Theodosius I issued sweeping decrees that banned pagan worship and sacrifice across the entire Roman Empire. In Alexandria, the campaign against the old religion was led by the Christian patriarch Theophilus, who held office from 385 to 412. When the conversion of a pagan temple sparked violence, the city's pagans barricaded themselves inside the Serapeum, taking hostages and defending their sanctuary. With the emperor's sanction, Christian crowds, led by Theophilus, stormed and demolished the Great Temple around 391 to 392. The church historians Socrates Scholasticus, Sozomen, and Rufinus of Aquileia all recorded the event. The destruction of the Serapeum has come to symbolize the end of classical pagan learning in Alexandria. Whether the library's scrolls were still inside at that exact moment is debated by historians. Some believe the books may already have been dispersed, and that the temple destroyed was no longer a working library. But the symbolism was undeniable. A few decades later, in 415, the brilliant pagan mathematician and philosopher Hypatia of Alexandria was murdered by a Christian mob, an act that has come to mark, in the popular imagination, the death of the ancient intellectual tradition in the city. Edward Gibbon, in his great history of Rome's decline, dramatized the loss as a tragedy for human learning. Today, the site is marked by the towering column known as Pompey's Pillar, erected under the Emperor Diocletian around 298, and modern archaeologists have uncovered its foundations and underground galleries. The Serapeum is often confused with the main Great Library, but they were distinct. What unites them is a single, recurring human impulse, the belief that the world can be forced to forget. And no ruler embraced that belief more completely than the first emperor of China. Number 9. Qin Shi Huang's burning of the books. In the year 213 before the Common Era, the most powerful man in China set out to erase the past itself. Qin Shi Huang, who lived from 259 to 210 BCE, was the first ruler to unify China, founding the Qin dynasty in 221. His chief minister was Li Si, a follower of the harsh philosophy known as legalism, which held that the state should exert total control over thought and behavior. The problem Li Si identified was that scholars kept using the histories of the past to criticize the policies of the present. They would point to ancient kings and say the emperor fell short. His solution was breathtaking in its ambition. In 213 BCE, Li Si proposed, and the emperor decreed, that the histories of all states other than Qin be burned. Privately held copies of the revered Confucian classics, including the Book of Songs and the Book of Documents, along with the writings of the so-called 100 schools of philosophy, were to be surrendered to the authorities and destroyed. The penalties were savage. Anyone caught merely discussing the banned Book of Songs or Book of Documents was to be executed. Anyone who used the past to criticize the present would have their entire family put to death. Certain practical books were spared, those on medicine, divination, agriculture, and forestry, and a single master copy of each text was kept in the Imperial Library. The following year, in 212 BCE, came the second act of terror, the burying of the scholars, in which tradition holds that around 460 scholars were executed, said to have been buried alive, for defying the emperor. Our main source for all of this is the great historian Sima Qian, who wrote his records of the Grand Historian around 94 BCE, under the succeeding Han dynasty. Some modern historians caution that the Han had every reason to exaggerate the crimes of the Qin, and the true scale may be smaller than the legend. There is a further twist. Because master copies survived in the Imperial Library, much knowledge endured, until the Qin dynasty itself collapsed. Around 206 BCE, the rebel general Xiang Yu reportedly burned the Qin palaces, including the Epang Palace, and with them the protected Imperial Archive. That second fire may have destroyed far more than the first. Afterward, Han scholars painstakingly reconstructed the lost classics from memory and from copies hidden inside walls, including the home of Confucius's own descendants. The emperor who tried to make the world begin again from his reign had failed. And that brings us, at last, to the most famous lost library of them all. Number 10. The Great Library of Alexandria. No library in history casts a longer shadow than the Great Library of Alexandria. It has become the very symbol of lost knowledge, the wound that humanity supposedly inflicted on itself. But the true story is stranger, and in some ways sadder than the legend. The library was founded in the early 3rd century before the Common Era, under Ptolemy I and his son Ptolemy II. It was part of a larger research institution called the Mauseon, the Temple of the Muses, from which we get the word museum. It drew the finest minds of the Mediterranean. Estimates of its holdings vary enormously, from 40,000 scrolls to 400,000 or even more. The Ptolemies pursued books with an almost predatory zeal. They reportedly ordered that any ship docking in Alexandria be searched for books, which were then seized and copied, with the copies sometimes returned to the owners while the originals stayed in the library. The roll call of scholars who worked there is astonishing. Euclid, who systematized geometry; Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy; Aristarchus, who proposed that the Earth orbits the Sun, 18 centuries before Copernicus. Archimedes is said to have studied there. The librarians included Zenodotus, Apollonius of Rhodes, and Callimachus, who created the Pinaeques, a catalog filling 120 scrolls, one of the first works of library science in history. Now here is the part the legend gets wrong. The Great Library was not destroyed in a single dramatic blaze. It died slowly, over centuries, from 1,000 small wounds. In 48 BCE, when Julius Caesar was besieged in Alexandria during a civil war, he set fire to ships in the harbor, and the flames spread to dockside warehouses, possibly destroying part of the collection. Yet the geographer Strabo, writing around 20 CE, does not clearly describe a functioning main library, suggesting it had already declined. Further damage came under the Emperor Aurelian in the 270s CE, when the royal Bruchaian quarter was destroyed in fighting. A popular story blames the Muslim conquest in 642 and the Caliph Omar for a final burning, but historians now widely reject that tale as a later invention. The truth is that the library was strangled by funding cuts, by the expulsion of scholars, and by the slow shifting of the world's centers of learning. No physical trace of the main library has ever been definitively found. In 2002, the modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina opened on the same shore, a deliberate act of remembering. And remembering, it turns out, is the whole point. Step back from these 10 stories, and a pattern emerges, sharp and unmistakable. In not one of these cases were the books burned because they were worthless. They were burned because they were powerful. A worthless book is simply ignored. It rots quietly on a shelf. It is the dangerous book, the book that contradicts the official story, that gets dragged into the square and set alight. Look at the motives, and they sort into a few clear categories. There is religious heresy, the fear that a text undermines the true faith. That drove the burning of the Talmud in Paris, the Maya Codices at Maní, and the pagan scrolls of the Serapeum. There is political control, the need of a regime to own the past. That drove Itzcoatl's destruction of the Aztec histories and the first Chinese emperor's burning of the classics. There is ethnic erasure, the attempt to destroy a people by destroying their memory, as at Jaffna. And there is conquest, where libraries burn as the collateral of war, but also as a deliberate statement, as at Nalanda, at Constantinople, and at Córdoba. Yet beneath all these motives runs a single logic, expressed perfectly by that first Chinese emperor. Whoever controls the record controls the future. A new regime, especially an insecure one, needs a clean origin story, and the inconvenient truth sitting in the archive is a threat that must be eliminated. Notice, too, the difference between a targeted purge and total destruction. Almanzor did not burn everything in Córdoba. He surgically removed the philosophy and astronomy and left the law books standing because his goal was political alignment, not blanket annihilation. The first emperor exempted books on medicine and farming because those served the state. The Aztecs kept writing books, just different ones. Destruction, in these cases, was a tool with a precise purpose. And consider why the method was so often fire specifically. Fire is public. Fire is total. Fire is irreversible. You cannot unburn a scroll. A burning in a city square is not just destruction. It is theater. A message broadcast to everyone watching that certain ideas will not be tolerated. The flames say, as loudly as anything can, that this knowledge is now forbidden. But what exactly did the flames take from us? The honest answer is that we will never fully know what we lost, and that uncertainty is itself part of the tragedy. Consider the Maya. An entire civilization wrote down its astronomy, its history, its prophecies, and its literature across thousands of books. And today, 4 survive. 4. Everything those vanished volumes contained, generations of accumulated observation of the sky, dynastic records, religious epics, is simply gone, beyond any hope of recovery. Consider the Greek world. We know that the great tragedians Sophocles and Euripides each wrote roughly 90 plays. From Sophocles, 7 complete plays survive. The rest we know only as names and scattered quotations, many of them lost in the centuries of fires and sacks that consumed Constantinople and Alexandria. Historians have a haunting term for this: dark knowledge, the things we know existed only because surviving texts happened to mention them. We have the shadow of the book without the book itself. At Córdoba, the philosophical and astronomical works that Almanzor purged represented a synthesis of Greek, Persian, and Indian learning that the West would not recover for centuries. At Tenochtitlan, the genuine pre-1428 history of the Mexica people is unrecoverable, locked away forever behind a deliberately constructed myth. The losses compound in a cruel way. When a library holds the only copy of a text, its burning is not a setback. It is an extinction. There is no backup, no second shelf in another city. Sometimes, brilliant detective work claws a fragment back. The Decipherment of Maya Glyphs by Yuri Knorozov, building on the very notes of the man who burned the books. Let us read the 4 survivors and the carved inscriptions on stone. The cracking of Egyptian hieroglyphs through the Rosetta Stone reopened 3,000 years of history. But these recoveries are partial, painstaking, and rare. For every script we relearn, countless individual works remain permanently silent. And yet, against all of this loss, the remarkable thing is that anything survived at all. Why did some knowledge escape the flames when so much did not? The answer, again and again, is dispersal. The single greatest protector of knowledge is the copy that happens to be somewhere else. The 4 surviving Maya codices survived precisely because they were not at Maní in 1562. They had already been carried across the ocean to Europe as exotic curiosities, sitting in collections in Dresden, Madrid, and Paris while their thousands of siblings burned. When Nalanda fell in 1193, monks fled north carrying what manuscripts they could into Tibet and Nepal, where those texts seeded a living tradition of Tibetan Buddhism that preserves Nalanda's scholarship to this day. When Constantinople was sacked, some manuscripts were carried west into Italy, where they waited in monasteries until Renaissance scholars rediscovered them and reignited the study of the classical world. Then there is concealment. When the first Chinese emperor demanded the Confucian classics, some families did not comply. They bricked the scrolls inside the walls of their houses, and generations later, during the Han Dynasty, those hidden texts were found again, including a famous cache discovered in the wall of a house belonging to the descendants of Confucius himself. There is reconstruction from memory, the Han scholars who could recite the classics rebuilding them word by word, creating the centuries-long scholarly debate between the Old Text and New Text versions. And there is the strangest preservation of all, the accidental gift from the destroyer. Diego de Landa burned the Maya books, then wrote down the key to reading them. The lesson that runs through every survival is redundancy. Knowledge that exists in only one place is knowledge waiting to die. Knowledge that has been copied, translated, and scattered across the world becomes almost impossible to extinguish. It was this realization, more than any other, that made the printing press so revolutionary. When a book exists in 1,000 identical copies, no single bonfire can erase it. The math of destruction had changed forever. Or had it? It would be comforting to believe that book burning belongs to a darker, more ignorant past, that we have evolved beyond it. The Jaffna fire of 1981 already tells us otherwise, and it was not alone. In August of 1992, during the siege of Sarajevo, Serbian forces deliberately shelled the National and University Library of Bosnia, the beautiful building known as the Vječnica. An estimated 1.5 to 2 million books and manuscripts, the documentary memory of a multi-ethnic nation, went up in flames, the burning pages drifting over the city like black snow. The impulse to erase a people by erasing their records is not ancient history. It is a recurring feature of human conflict. And our modern solution, digitization, carries its own hidden dangers. On one hand, a text scanned and copied to servers around the world is more secure than any scroll ever was, immune to any single fire. On the other hand, we have created new kinds of fragility, archives that depend on fragile formats, on corporations, on electricity and functioning machines, single points of failure that a future disruption could erase as cleanly as any torch. This is why institutions like UNESCO created the Memory of the World program, a deliberate effort to identify and safeguard the documentary heritage most at risk. And throughout history, the response to destruction has been the same act of defiance, rebuilding. The Jaffna Library reopened, restored, in 2003. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina rose on the Egyptian shore in 2002. A new Nalanda University was established in 2014, reclaiming a name that had been silent for 8 centuries. Each act of rebuilding is a refusal, a statement that the people who lit the fires did not, in the end, win, because the deepest truth about every library on this list is hidden in plain sight. Every library that was ever burned represents the same desperate bet, the belief that forgetting can be enforced. The friar at Maní, the emperor in China, the warlord in Córdoba, the mob at Jaffna, all of them were wagering that if they could only destroy the record, they could control what came after. They feared these books, and you should sit with that for a moment, because it is the most important thing these 10 stories have to teach. They feared the books because books are powerful. A scroll of astronomy, a history of a people, a book of law, a collection of philosophy. These are not passive objects. They are arguments across time, the voice of the past refusing to stay silent, the evidence that the official story is not the only story. That is precisely why they burn. But here is the quiet irony that undoes every one of these acts. We are talking about them right now. We remember the Maya Codices, and so the 4 survivors are studied more intensely than ever. We remember Nalanda, and a new university bears its name. We remember Jaffna, and its rebuilt halls stand as a monument to exactly the identity the fire was meant to erase. The act of remembering a book burning is itself the defeat of that burning. The arsonists wanted erasure, and instead they created a story that outlived them, a story that teaches every generation to guard knowledge more fiercely. So what do these ashes ask of us? They ask us to understand that recorded knowledge is both more valuable and more fragile than we usually admit, that it survives not by luck, but by being copied, shared, translated, and remembered. They ask us to be the kind of people who carry the scroll to the next city, who hide it in the wall, who rebuild the library, because the past is always at the mercy of the present, and the only thing that truly defeats the fire is a person who refuses to forget. That person today is you.